ready, class 4, and we're ready to learn. So, Bakasha, let's go.
Righty-ho. So we're going to move a little bit away from translation today. You'll remember the first session, we thought a little bit about which text are we translating, because it might make a difference. For instance, if you do or you don't include material from the Dead Sea Scrolls, or whether you just go with the traditional Masoretic text. So today we're going to go back to the Masoretic text, and we are going to find out about the Masoretes, who I personally think are the unsung heroes of the whole of Judaism, really. And nobody knows anything about them generally. I don't know, maybe we have some Masoretic fans out here, but certainly I knew nothing about them till I actually decided I would find out. And then it was so fascinating, I felt I had to include it in this session. So if you've ever read from the Siddur, or you've learned a bit of laning on your own from a Tikkun, or you've ever followed the Torah reading from a Chumash, in fact, if you've ever read any Tanakh in Hebrew at all, you have benefited from the work of the Masoretes, even if you didn't know it. But as I said, not many people really are very conscious of them. If you can conjure up a mental picture of the Dead Sea Scrolls, or indeed of a modern Torah scroll, you will know that there are no vowels written in the text, and there certainly aren't any laning notes, any te'amim written in the text, or some people call the trop in Yiddish. There were no vowels, there were no punctuation, no trop notes, and that was standard and universal until the Masoretes developed all those things. So we owe them a huge debt of gratitude, because I, for one, would not want to try any of the above activities if I didn't have vowels, not if I wanted to get it right. And up to the point when they devised a way of recording this in writing or in symbols, written symbols, it was an oral tradition. Not to say that people didn't know how to read it, but it was orally learnt and orally transmitted. And unless you sat with somebody, and you wouldn't necessarily know how you pronounced the letters of the Torah, the Torah text, even if you could read, because what you were reading was consonants, and you needed somebody to model the vowels for you. And as for singing it, we really don't know what laning sounded like anything more than about 100 years ago. But obviously you wouldn't have known that tradition unless somebody taught it to you orally. So it's thanks to the Masoretes we can read the Tanakh at all. And you could call the Masoretes, I think, computer geeks before computers were invented, because they not only invented these very handy systems of laning notes and vowels, they also counted and compared and listed and noted every feature of the biblical text. And they did this in order to safeguard it. It's what you might think of as metatext. It's text about the text, to make sure that you never make mistakes when you copy it out. And in a pre-printing era, that's really, really important, because it's almost impossible to copy out text by hand absolutely perfectly and accurately. Even Sefer Torah, as you know, we occasionally find mistakes in them in the middle of reading them in shul. So let's get the handout up. I'm presuming I can share. Yes, there we are. Let's go to the beginning. There we are. So for a nice summary of what the Masoretes did, here we have a wonderful book that I would recommend, Barry Levy's Fixing God's Torah. He says, practically speaking, the Masorah or Masoret includes the entire corpus of traditional teachings about the Bible text. Hundreds of lists of often abstruse data about the text. We might look at one of those. And any rare or unusual phenomena in it. Comparisons of similar or identical usages, spellings, or constructions within a single book, within the third of the Bible in which that book appears, i.e. Torah, Nevi'im, prophets, or Ketuvim, writings, or within the entire Bible. Tabulations of the numbers of verses in each book, the number of times each letter in the alphabet can be found in that book and in the Tanakh globally, and similar material. So it's, as I say, it's geeky. Real geeky stuff. If you like computers, you'll love the Masoretes. The actual word Masorah or Masoret means tradition or handing something over. You can still use the word limsor in modern Hebrew in that way, to hand something over to somebody else, which is a very apt term for tradition. Now, there were actually 3 Masoretic traditions: Babylonian, Palestinian, and Tiberian. The one we still use today is the Tiberian, but we'll just mention the other two here and there. But most of what I'm going to be talking about is about the Tiberian system, because that's what we know most about, because that's what survived. Okay, so it's not clear really when the Masoretes started their work, or when you have scholars who are dedicated very much to this whole project, but it's clear that problems with establishing the exact and correct biblical text were apparent as early as the Talmudic period. And how do we know? Because the Talmud tells us so. So we have a text that actually appears in 4 versions, very similar. I've given the Jerusalem Talmud one here in Ta'anit, but it also appears in things like Avot de Rabbi Natan and Sophrim, which is a post-Talmudic tractate, and also in midrashic works, it appears in Sifrei Devarim. So we'll look at the Jerusalem Talmud version of this. And that tells you 3 books they found in the temple court. And we have to understand this as Sifrei Torah. 3 Sifrei Torah they found in the temple itself. The book Me'oni, the book Zetute, and the book He. In the one, they found written Ma'on Elokei Kedem, and in the 2 they found written Me'ona. This is a verse from Dvarim 33. It's in Vizot HaBracha. It's actually part of the very, very last bit that the Chatan Torah reads. And in these 3 Sifrei Torah from the temple, one version had the variant Ma'on, and 2 of the other 2 scrolls had the version that we use today, Me'ona. They upheld the 2 and they set aside the 1. In other words, they said, okay, the proper reading is the one that is the majority reading, Me'ona, and that's what we have in our Masoretic text today. We will set aside this variant Ma'on, because there's only 1 out of the 3 scrolls that has that. In the 1, they found written, Vayishlach Zetute b'nei Yisrael, and in the 2, they found written, Vayishlach Na'arei b'nei Yisrael, a verse from Shemot about sending the young men of Israel to do sacrifices. So they upheld the 2, where they found the word Na'arei, and that's the version we have now. And they set aside the 1, that would be the Zetute, that was the minority version. In the 1, they found written 9 times he, as opposed to who. And in the 2, they found written 11 times he, as opposed to who. And they upheld the 2 and set aside the 1. This probably refers to the fact that in the Torah, sometimes the word he is written with a vav, rather than with a yud, which is what you would expect. So that's what it seems to be talking about here, that some of those that you might have read who actually were he. And it's interesting to think how that was actually conveyed. Was it just conveyed by the consonants, or was there another way of knowing? So what we see here is a very early form of text checking, of ascertaining what is the correct text of the Torah. And it's quite a simple principle. It's if you have several variants, you go with the majority, which is pretty reasonable. Yeah, you've got, you presume 2 scribes got it right, and maybe 1 scribe got it wrong. But it's fascinating that this is talking about temple times. So this is not a later tradition that's been projected back to the temple, and we don't have any way of checking that. It is telling you that before the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, there were already uncertainties about the exact writing of the Torah, and the exact words, and sometimes exact, just things between he and who, that's just a grammatical thing. It's not majorly significant as to meaning. Neither is Me'oni and Ma'on come to that. Not sure about Zetute, I don't even know what it means. So it looks as though there were already some problems way back as to establishing an exact text. And that might be a bit of a surprise, because these days we're very used to an idea that gets promulgated everywhere, that the text of the Torah is miraculously preserved and never has any variants at all. But all you need to do actually is look at the Torah and realize it's not actually being miraculously preserved. It's being preserved in a very good way by human activity such as that of the Masoretes. So a little bit later, we see other things that look like Masoretic activity. We see things in the Talmud Bavli. There are references to things like the total number of verses in books, or total number of verses in sections, or counting things, which sounds really Masoretic. So we'll have a look at an interesting example from Kiddushin in the Bavli. The early scholars were called Sophrim, which we now think of as just scribes. because they used to count all the letters of the Torah. And of course, lispor is to count. Like mispar is a number, lispor in Hebrew is to count. So soprim are really counters, not just scribes. They're people who count. Okay, the presumption is they did count all the letters in the Torah, and thus they said that the vav in the word gachon, and that'll be in the on part, that'll be a vav there, which comes in Vayikra chapter 11, marks half the letters of the Torah. Apparently that vav, which is written large in a Torah scroll, marks halfway through the Torah if you count letters. Darosh, Darash, also in Vayikra, of course, because it's the middle book, chapter 10, that's halfway through if you count by words. And the word Vehit Galach, which is in Vayikra chapter 13, half the verses. Okay, so we've got a halfway point for letters, words, and verses that the Talmud claims was established by early scholars. Then it, for some reason, only looks at Sefer Tehillim. The book of Psalms doesn't mention any other books and tries to do the same thing for that. The boar out of the wood, miya'ar, in Psalm 80, the ayin of the word ya'ar, or wood, marks half of the Psalms, presumably letters, but could be words, because it doesn't say. And then another very well-known verse, but he full of compassion forgives their iniquity. That is, it's Psalm 78, that's half of the verses. The rabbis could be just as pernickety as later Masoretic scholars. So Rabbi Joseph propounded, does the vav of Gachon belong to the first half or the second half? If we have an even number of letters in the Torah, which he's assuming, I don't know why, then the vav must either be in half number 1 or half number 2. If we have an odd number of letters in the Torah, then the vav is going to be the central letter. So he's presuming, for reasons I don't know, that it's got to be either before the break or after the break. But the response is lovely. They said to him, let a scroll of the Torah be brought and we will count them. I love this idea of all the rabbis just frantically counting through the Sefer Torah to just find where is this halfway point. Did not Rabba bar Bahana say, they did not stir from there till a scroll of the Torah was brought and they counted them. They actually did it. It then doesn't tell you where it was. Oh well. Then it says something that is connected. They were thoroughly versed in the defective and full readings, but we are not. Now, defective and full readings, or in Hebrew, it's chaser and maleh, are about the sort of optional letters, the letters that often represent vowels, and those are particularly vav and yud. And in some places, those letters are included. In other places, those letters are dropped out. So a defective, a chaser writing of any word somewhere in Tanakh would be one where an expectable yud wasn't there, or an expectable vav wasn't there. Think of the word like sukkot. How many vavs do you want to put in it? And a maleh is when you put them in, a full version. So a maleh version of sukkot would be samech, vav, kaf, vav, tav. And a chaser version might be samech, kaf, vav, tav. Okay. So why is that connected here? Because given the fact that they're not consistent in the Torah, there are sometimes words are presented with the full spelling, the maleh spelling, or sometimes they're presented with the chaser, the defective spelling, you can't necessarily predict. So that might mean that your total number of letters in the Torah would be affected by that. So the idea that once upon a time back then, they actually knew precisely which words were read or written with the extra vowels or yuds and which weren't, would affect the number count. So we can't reproduce this counting is essentially what this text is saying. We just have to trust they knew what they were doing. Then it goes on to bigger numbers. Our rabbis taught there are 5,888 verses in Torah. The Psalms, Tehillim, exceed this by 8. And Chronicles, why are they choosing Chronicles? Divrei Hayamim, I have no idea, are less by 8. So it looks as though they've just sort of picked 2 books at random to accompany the number in the Torah. Interestingly, none of this corresponds with our current Masoretic text. I'm very sorry to tell you that the halfway verse, according to the current Masoretic version we have, is not, where's the verse? Here we are, Vayikra 10:16, it's Vayikra 8:7. And actual numbers of verses, it's not 5,888. We actually have 5,845 verses in the Torah. Psalms, that should be a little bit more in the 5,900s. I can't do mental arithmetic. I'm sorry to tell you that the actual number of verses we have currently in Psalms is 2,527. What about Divrei Hayamim? Again, it should be 5,880. It's actually 1,765. So something's going on there. We might discuss what actually is happening. We also have, besides this version of this text we saw talking about defective and full readings, the Malech Haser, we have other references to that. So here in the midrashic text, Rabba, we have Rabba Shmuel Bar Nachman said, all the instances of the word toldot in the Torah are chaserim. They don't have the full complement of verbs, except for two. And we can see that this is an issue. There are too many quotes of this type to say, oh, everyone agreed on the text back then. It's quite clear that their protective formulations are having to be brought in so that you can be absolutely sure you've got the words right, or you're seeking to make sure the words are right. And we also have early records of distinctive features that we still find in the Sefer Torah. So for instance, there are dotted letters in the Sefer Torah. Very, very famously, Dvarim 29, Lanu ulevanenu, for us and for our children, has a dot over each letter of the word. You may know other ones about when Esav and Yaakov meet, there are dots over the word Vaishakehu, where he kissed him. Here's a rather little one. Sifri Bamidbar, on a distant journey, B'derech Rechoka, there's a dot over the hey of Rechoka. And there still is in our Sifri Torah. So here we've got very early evidence that there were special features in the writing of Sifri Torah, large letters, small letters, dots, and these were known back then. So we have a list of the dotted words in Avot Rabbi Natan, which is maybe 700, 900 CE, something like that. And the list includes why they're there. It includes a list of meanings for each version. There are 10 in the Torah, and they're all listed there. And I think we have those all today. We don't have discrepancies there. And at the end of the passage, there is a fascinating hint that these may have been doubtful words or letters. And we certainly know that in Greek manuscripts from this time, that is exactly how doubtful or uncertain words were marked. People put dots above them to go, I'm not quite sure if I copied this one right, or this was in the copy I had before me when I copied it, but it seems a bit crazy to me. They put dots. And look how this sounds like Avidah Rabbi Natan. Now, why are all these passages dotted? This is what Ezra said. Ezra here is understood as restoring the Torah after Babylonian exile. If Elijah comes and says to me, why did you write in this fashion? What were you doing putting dots in the Torah? I shall say to him, that's why I dotted those passages. So Elijah's saying, why I've got these words in? Well, I put dots on them because I wasn't sure. And if he says to me, you have written well, yes, those words should be in there, I shall remove the dots from them. So here is maybe 8th century, 9th century picture of Ezra marking uncertain words with dots. Is that what the dots actually mean? Well, we don't absolutely know. And there are lots and lots of midrashic interpretations. You may very well know the one for Vishakehu, the one for Esav kissing Yaakov. The dots are there to say he tried to bite his neck, but it turned into marble, says the midrash. That's why the dots are there. So you wouldn't think that actually, Esav harbored pleasant feelings towards Yaakov. No, he wanted to attack him. The dots show it was a treacherous kiss. So there are lots of midrashic explanations like that. But is it possible that these are later and that the original meaning of the dots was, we're not 100% sure whether this letter or this word should be there or if it's been spelled right, or who knows? We honestly don't know, because though we have a lot of these records, and we've already looked at several texts that mark Maleh and Chaser spelling, and that mark dots. And there are other texts that talk about, for instance, things like the very large bet in the word Breshit that starts the Torah. It's written larger than the other letters. If you go to the first word of the book of Vayikra, you will see there is a little tiny aleph at the end of Vayikra, much smaller than the other letters. And those are features that are in all our Torah scrolls, and presumably go back a very, very long way. And many of them are documented in early rabbinic texts. What they mean may or may not be clear from those early rabbinic texts. So these are all features that are carefully preserved in the Masoretic tradition, little notes in Masoretic copies of the Tanakh that record all these things, so that the scribe who's coming along to copy the text and goes, I don't know why this aleph is small, can look on the side and it'll be a little note saying, write this aleph small. It's a safeguarding. It's a sort of over-determination of the text. It's a text about the text. The Masoretic notes tell you what you should be doing with this text and guard you from making errors, because these things aren't terribly logical. Why should you write the aleph of Bayit plus small? There's no particular reason that would be apparent to a scribe. You just have to know that's what you do. So the Masoretic text is designed, the notes that we'll talk about in more detail in a moment, it's designed to preserve the text so it doesn't change, and to preserve the correct type, the correct spelling and the correct features of the text. Now, that's much easier to do when you have printing. That's much easier to do when you have computers. This was a heroic project to note every detail of every word and just about every letter of the entire text of Tanakh. Well, you know, you try doing that with papyrus and pen. Not much fun. Interestingly, this little bit from about the Rabbi Natan really represents Ezra as sort of the first Masoretic scholar. It's not a problem for Moshe. He gets the original copy. He doesn't have to worry about whether some of these words should be dotted or should be in or should be out or what have you. Moshe has no worries. But Ezra, who is the second Moshe, has these worries. He's not sure. He has to pay attention to preserving the text. So Ezra, you could say, is the first Masorete, even though we don't really think of him in that way. Note, he also has the authority to actually change things. He puts dots in the Torah scroll. Blimey, couldn't do that now. So there's an interesting idea here that there is some sort of authority for marking uncertainty in the text. And that's very much what gets developed in the Masoretic world. And some of these early comments are even phrased in the same way as the later Masoretic notes. But the early comments that we've seen already in the rabbinic literature don't always agree with the later Masorah. So sometimes you'll have declarations like the Talmud saying, all instances of the word toldot in the Torah are chasarim, they don't have the extra vav. I think actually there's more than two that are chasarim. So they don't always match up. And that's often been a source of worry to later scholars going, how can I agree? Another example is the Talmud understands what we now call Psalm 1 and Psalm 2 as a single psalm. We see it as two psalms. So quite often divisions seem to have moved. Another good example is the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which are often understood as one book in the Talmud, not as two books. We think of them today as two books, but apparently Talmudic times they were seen as a single book. And what do we do about these differences, for instance, with the differences with where the mid-letter is, and where the mid-word is, and where the mid-verse is? Again, it may be to do with the chaser and malay spellings, which would change the number of letters, but it probably also has to do where you put the beginnings and ends of verses. And it seems obvious to us today, but if you have a written text that has no punctuation at all, how do you know where the end of a verse is? It's not obvious. Somebody at some point has to decide, or somebody has to pass on a tradition that everybody agrees with. And maybe in different places, people don't agree. So we can perhaps understand why these numbers don't work for our version of the text, because a lot of water has flowed under the bridge since then, and things like verse division, have changed a little bit, perhaps. The other thing is when you're looking at letters, it may not just be talking about halfway through all the letters of the Torah. It could very well be talking about halfway through the exceptional letters, the big and the small and the peculiar ones. Another very famous one is in the story of Pinchas. God gives Pinchas a brit shalom, and the vav of that word shalom has a little cut through it. It's written in two strokes, not in one, as it would be everywhere else in the entire Torah. So the middle letter could be halfway through all the peculiar letters in the Torah. I don't know if anyone's checked that or not. I certainly haven't. But we can deduce that the foundations of what became the Masoretic enterprise are laid during this time when people are making notes about the text and are concerned about the correct text. What else did they do? They didn't spend their whole time doing that. They invented vowels, bless their hearts, which I'm eternally grateful to the Masoretes for doing that. And this doesn't seem to be before roughly 600 to 750 CE. Vowels are never mentioned in the Talmud. And the Christian writer Jerome, who knew Hebrew, he died in the year 420 CE, and he actually worked with Jews. He was translating the Bible into Latin. And he explicitly said that the Jews don't have any way of showing vowels. He did, because he was writing Latin, and it includes vowels, but standard original Hebrew, pre-Masoretic Hebrew, has no vowels at all. So they came up with interesting systems. 3 of them, we use the Tiberian system, but there are other ones as well. When are our earliest examples of manuscripts with the vowels? That would be the Cairo Codex of the Prophets. That was written by a Masorete called Moshe ben Asher in Tiberias in the year 895 CE. And we know that because he wrote it in the colophon. And the colophon of a book is the little bit at the end where the proud scribe says, I, Moshe ben Asher, of the glorious city of Tiberias, wrote this in the year, and often gives the date. And sometimes there might be a little poem. There might be the very often quoted thing, Tam v'nishlam shevach l'Hashem borei olam, the praise and it's finished and completed, praise to God, the creator of the world. You find that in colophons. You find other things in colophons. So the colophon of the Cairo Codex of the Prophets says this was written by Moshe ben Asher in 895. Some scholars want to revise the dating because they did some radiocarbon dating on the actual paper it's written on, and that shows 11th century, which is a bit later. So who knows? It's either 895 or it's a little bit later than that, but it has a full set of vowels and also the laning notes, the trop or the te'amim, to give them their proper term. The fascinating thing about the Cairo Codex of the Prophets is nobody's quite sure where it is. It's massively important. It used to be in Cairo, obviously, in a Karaite synagogue there, and a lot of places still say it's there, but there are also accounts that it was smuggled out of Egypt in the 1980s by Karaite Jews, and that they've given it to the Hebrew University, who is keeping it secretly. And there's certainly at least one reporter from the Jerusalem Post who's come up with that claim. So who knows? He says that he was told by a Karaite that the Hebrew University were given custody on the condition they never reveal where it is. So if that's true, then of course they're not going to say they've got it. But and I don't know why most of these very precious ancient books weren't on view to communities. They were only brought out by guardians on special occasions. So it might not be possible, if it is still in Cairo, to go and see it, because the local Karaites, I don't know how many are left, might be saying, no, we're not showing it to anyone, it's too holy. That's a bit of a mystery. If anyone can enlighten me later on, I'd be very glad to hear. I just can't find any really definite information on where it is. So clearly, developing a system of vowels is really, really important, because then you guarantee the pronunciation of the words correctly. And those of us who have learned, those of us who have tried reading biblical Hebrew correctly, know that even with the vowels we've got, there are a lot of traps, and how much more so without the vowels, you just wouldn't be able to read the thing correctly at all. It's not quite clear if vowels and the laning notes were developed at the same time. Maybe yes, maybe no, don't know. Here are the systems we didn't use, and you can see that, interestingly, they're all above the letters. Some of them look very like ours. For instance, the tsere here in the Babylonian tsere looks like our tsere, but our tsere goes underneath, not on top. The chirik looks like our chirik, but our chirik goes underneath, not on top. And then you get weird things like what looks a bit like a shva, one of the laning notes, katan, sorry, this is katan, is here on top of the notes, and it's the cholan. So, what are we going to do with this? Sorry, frog in the throat. And here is the Palestinian version. And again, you can see it's quite, some of the signs are the same. And this is our sigol, but on top. But these didn't take off, and our system took off. I don't know why. I have no idea. So round about 600, they're doing this. They're inventing the vowels, they're inventing the te'amim, and they're really getting the whole Masoretic project underway, and they're all massively writing down how many instances of this word appear in the Torah, and how you spell this word, and whether this rhymes Malay or Chaseh. And it seems to be dozens at least of scholars working over a couple of 100 years, 200 or 300 years to get this system really going. I don't know if they're doing it full time, but it's a massive, massive project if you don't have a computer. Now, it seems to be agreed very early on you couldn't write in the Torah scroll, like nothing. All you can write in the Torah scroll is the consonants of the text, and that's it. You can't put newfangled vowels in. You certainly can't put laming notes in, absolutely not. Gradually, it became accepted that if you were using scrolls for your own private use and not in shul, maybe you could do that. And we have the remains of a couple of scrolls, copies of the Torah with vowels from the Cairo Geniza. But they seem to be quite small and they're not very common. And clearly it was just, a couple of people, maybe people who lamed regularly had them at home so they could practice, not sure. And they also had Masoretic notes in the margins. Then the next development is around about the year 700. It took Jews a long time to develop the use of books. We were big scroll people for a long time. The new fashioned form, what we think of now as a book, this thing, this is actually a codex. I suppose a book is just, a written work of some type. A scroll, we all know what a scroll is, and this is a codex. Christians adopted codexes, or codices is the proper form, in about the 3rd century. Jews didn't go for it till about the 700s, something like that. So once you had a codex form and you decided it was permitted to write the Tanakh in a codex form, it clearly wasn't a Sefer Torah that you were going to use in shul. It clearly had a different status. And then if you want to put the vowels in that, hey, go ahead, write all the vowels you want, write anything you want, write Masoretic notes. So that's when we start getting our manuscripts. A little bit later than that, that's when we start getting our manuscripts of what we now think of as Masoretic codexes with all the information in, and they were used as models for writing Sefer Torah. It's just when you wrote a Sefer Torah, you left out the vowels and the notes. And we have scholarly families who are Masoretes who pass down their traditions, probably because a lot of this was oral. How do you pronounce this vowel? It's no use just writing it down. You need somebody to go, oh, this one's an eh, this one's an oo. So it did pass down in families. And the most famous families were the Ben Naphtali and the Ben Asher family. We know more about Ben Asher family because their traditions more widely accepted and they're sort of ancestral to what we do. And they began with, as far as we know, they began with Asher the elder, who lived in the 2nd half of the 8th century. And there are 5 generations we know about, ending with Moshe ben Asher, who we just mentioned as writing the Cairo Codex of the Prophets, and his son Aharon ben Asher, possibly the most famous Masorete ever. Moshe ben Asher, his dad, as well as doing the Cairo Codex, may have done an absolutely beautiful Masoretic Codex in the British Library, which is a few miles from where I'm sitting, and which used to be on display. It doesn't have a romantic name like the Cairo Codex. It's just called Orientalia 4445. And it used to be on display, and it was so clear and so beautifully written that I used to take my daughters when they were quite small to see it, and aged about 9 or 10, they would stand there reading out Sukkim to show off to the visitors, who were amazed at these small girls who could read this weird Oriental manuscript. So it's very, very, very clear indeed. So the last and most famous family member was, as we said, Aharon ben Asher. He's living the 1st half of the 10th century, so roughly time of Sagagon. And his system of vowels and tradition of Masoretic notes and tradition of termim gradually became accepted as the best, the top of the line. He's also credited with writing a book, a Masoretic treatise called Diktuke HaTe'omim, which is all about the vowels and the termim and how to do it. It's almost like a grammar because it's got rules and principles. So this is actually before the classic Hebrew grammars have been written, but obviously this is sort of layer 1 of Hebrew grammar work. And there are 2 massively important manuscripts of the Bible associated with Aharon ben Asher. And the first one is the Leningrad Codex, which you may have heard of. That was written in the year 1008 by a scribe called Shmuel ben Yaakov, but he copied it from manuscripts by Aharon ben Asher, so it preserves his tradition. And the other one is even more famous, the Aleppo Codex, which you, again, might have heard of. In Hebrew, it's Keta Aram Sova. And there, from the colophon, again, from that note at the end, we find that the scribe was called Shlomo ben Buya'a, but the vowels, he only did the consonants, the vowels and the laming notes were done by Aharon ben Asher himself. So we actually have his handwriting and his text. Also, he did the Masoretic notes that accompanied. And that dates in the 1st half of the 9th century. And it's generally accepted as the very, very best example of the Ben Asher tradition. And there are quite firm traditions that Maimonides, the Rambam, used that book, that actual physical copy, to write his own copy of the Sefer Torah, and that his notes on how Sefer Torah should be written are derived from that very book, which still exists. If that's true, that's very exciting. And the Aleppo Codex has had the most exciting history ever. I can't tell you. They have made films. They should make more films. It was bought by a Karaite Jewish community in Jerusalem about 100 years after it was made. Then it was stolen during the First Crusade, somewhere around about 1096, 1097. It was taken to Egypt, and the local Jewish community in Egypt ransomed it from the Crusaders. They bought that book back. And then it stayed in a rabbinite, a non-Karaite shul there. We're rabbinites, in case you hadn't realized. And in the 14th century, it seems to have been taken up to Aleppo in Syria. And the community in Aleppo regarded it almost like an amulet. It was their great, great treasure, and they wouldn't let anyone see it. Somebody managed to get in the 1850s and painstakingly wrote an account of it and recorded a lot of the variations. That manuscript with the 19th century copy or notes on it was only discovered in 1989. And you'll see why in a moment. That was very important. Even the great, but unfortunately, Christian scholar Paul Kahler, who was the world expert on the Masorah, was not allowed to see it by the Aleppo community. He tried in the 1920s, so he couldn't use the Aleppo when he made his sort of scientific academic edition of the Bible that we're going to talk about later. So the only modern scholar who was allowed anywhere near it was Umberto Casso, who was an Italian scholar who lived in Israel, made Aliyah. He died in 1951. And he also very helpfully made notes on it in 1943. And that was vital, because in 1947, the synagogue got burned down in a riot, and the Codex was said to have been damaged at that point. And if you look at it today, we only have the last few pages of Devarim. So pages are missing. Roughly 200 pages are missing from the entire book. Beginning, end, and weirdly, some in the middle. But the story gets a bit complicated here, because they've analyzed the damaged leaves and they've discovered it's not fire damage, it is fungus damage. That book was never burnt. It has had mushrooms growing on it, basically. And then it got smuggled out of Syria into Israel in 1958. Wonderful story. It got smuggled in a washing machine, of all things. I just hate to think about this. And it was presented to the Israeli president, who was Ben Zvi at the time. And it's now in the Israel Museum, and it's the focus of a huge publication enterprise. But because of this, a lot of doubts about how it got to Israel and what actually happened to those first 200 pages, it is thought that they may be out there, because a couple of the missing pages have turned up between 1982 and 2007. If you want the whole story, which is lurid in the extreme, you must read the book, which I think is called The Aleppo Codex by an Israeli journalist called Matti Friedman. It's a fascinating read. And he's done an expose of some of the wheelings and dealings that went on. And I just want to quote one sentence from his book. He says, "A volume that survived 1,000 years of turbulent history was betrayed in our times with the people charged with guarding it." So watch this space. There may yet be more to say on that. In the meantime, several modern editions of the Bible, the Jerusalem Crown of 2000 was based on it. Also, the Bar Ilan University's Haketer Mikraot Gedolot, if you know that, that's based on it. Mosat Rav Kook put out their Torah Chaim based on the Aleppo Codex. And there's some other ones, Dat Mikra, which is a modern Israeli commentary series, that's based on the Aleppo text. So that's the Ben Asher tradition, which is really, really important. Ben Naphtali, we don't know much about the Ben Naphtali tradition. We just know it was different. There were lists of the differences between the two traditions, but as they were copied over the years, errors were copied in, so we still don't really know very much about that. They're probably very small, like different vowels and questions of laning notes, and probably not the sort of thing that anyone but a Masoret would care about. What else did they do? They wrote books. They wrote books to try and systematize and record knowledge about it. And we're going to look at an absolutely mad one, which is here it is. This is the 1864 edition, and it's called Ochla Va'ochla. It is a collection of lists. If you're a list person, this is a book for you. There is a modern Spanish edition, so you don't have to find the 1864 one. It's about 400 lists of words, and it gets its title from the first list, which is here, Ochla Va'ochla. There is ochla. You can see the cursor. And here is v'ochla. And what it is a list of all the words in the Bible that appear once, but in a double form. Once the word on its own, and once with v and in front of it. Ochla, va'ochla. But they only appear once each in the entire Tanakh. And yes, I know it's a little bit recherche, isn't it? So ochla va'ochla, and then we have omra va'omra, and then we have achaye va'achaye, and all of these only occur once, remember. So somebody, see what I mean about computer geek, somebody's gone through the whole of Tanakh, and we're only up to Beth here, it's pages more of it. Just to give you another flavor of it, there's I can't tell you the craziness of the list. List 72 is all the words that appear twice. So me'od, me'od, or Esav's demanding the lentil porridge. He says, give me some of that adom, adom hazeh. So that would be on the list. So all examples of words that appear twice in a row are documented in list 72. And it's pretty amazing. We think it was written originally in the 9th to 12th centuries. It was, seems to have been used. People used it as a checking thing. Am I right? I've got the second va'ochla. Is there one or two u'its in the list? No, that shouldn't be there, etc. So it's pretty amazing. That's just one of the many, many Masoretic books. A lot of them are concerned with Hebrew grammar, so you can trying to explain rules, perhaps where there are variants that look incorrect in the Torah. They want to discover the rules and say, no, do not correct this word. It is correct. I can show you it's grammatical. Another thing that they standardize, I'll go backwards here, is the Ketiv Kreh. And Ketiv Kreh is, you get this, you probably haven't noticed it, even though every Chumash you've ever seen will have it in. It's Ketiv is the version as we write it in the Sefer Torah, or print it in a Chumash or any book of the Bible. And the Kreh is how you read it. They're not always the same. So here's an example from Breshit. This is the Noah story, Kol Chayash, etc. You get to the word that is written as Hey Vav Tzadi Aleph. And that's how it appears in the Torah scroll. However, it is pronounced as though the Vav is a Yud, Hayetse. And that's how we pronounce it. And Ketiv Kreh happens all over the Bible. The book of Shmuel is riddled with them. And quite a lot in the Torah too. And you will find something, some Chumashim will have a little, they'll print it, the original word without vowels, and there'll be a star, and you'll have to look in the margin to find the Kreh. Art Scroll does this sort of double thing like this. It's actually from Safari. This is how Safari uses, shows Ketiv Kreh, and Ketiv will be in the round brackets, and Kreh will be in the square brackets. But every printed copy of the Masoretic text will have these in. What are they? Why do we have two versions? Sometimes it's a whole word. Book of Ruth has got various oddities also, and there are several that there's a completely different word. We don't read what's written, we read something else altogether. What are they about? Not sure. Fascinatingly, the great commentator Rabbi David Kimchi, the Radak, I'll put his dates there, thought they were the result of mistakes, which you might get lynched if you said that today in certain places. But he says these variant words apparently developed because during the first exile, means the Babylonian exile, the texts were lost, the scholars were dispersed, and the Torah scholars died. The men of the Great Assembly, who are a shadowy lot of people who live about 200 BCE to the turn of the era, we don't know much about them, who restored the Torah to its former state, found differences in the text. This is reminiscent of our 3 scrolls in the temple. And they followed the reading of those which they believed to be in the majority, just as we saw. When they were unclear about this, they wrote one version without pointing it, but that puts in the vowels in. Or they wrote it in the margin and not in the text, which we find in some manuscripts. Or they wrote one version in the margin and one version in the text. In other words, you either took out the problematic word and what you thought it was, or you left the problematic word in and you put the correction in the margin. So that's fascinating. The Radak says, well, it's the result of the passage of time and the fact that no, the text of the Torah is not guarded divinely from corruption and mistakes. And we do have some mistakes. So we include everything we know, all the information. And one day perhaps when Elijah comes and decides on the dotted letters, he will decide on the Ketiv Kri as well. However, in the Kabbalistic tradition, you'll find interpretations of both. You'll find an interpretation based on here, Hey Vav Tzadi Aleph, and also the Hayt Se as we vocalize it. And you'll find a reason given for why there might be two words or alternative versions. So it rather depends where you're coming from. How do the Masoretes end their enterprise? Well, basically, I think they did it all. We think they wound down the whole project around about 950 CE, by which time the Tiberian system had won out against the other ones, and that's the system we still use today. And the manuscripts in the next 150 years try to preserve Masoretic traditions very faithfully. But after about 1100, the standard of copying goes down, and there are more and more errors in the Masoretic notes, and people are just sort of copying them but not reading them or using them. And sometimes the Masoretic notes don't match the Bible version that's being used. There's more than one Masoretic text. There are differences with vavs and yuds, not major differences, but there are. And sometimes the notes in the margin of codex will not match the text that they're meant to be for. And they'll have come from a different text. Finally, copyists lost all understanding of the Masoretic notes, really, and they made them into pretty patterns. And there are lots of lovely, beautiful medieval Hebrew manuscripts where the Masoretic notes are written in tiny, tiny, tiny letters in the shapes of flowers and whales and little arcades, and they're gorgeous. But A, you can't read them, and B, they contain a lot of errors. They're just there, you know, you have to put them in. And so we'll make something pretty out of them. And they stop being a useful technique and they start being something that's not really understood. And it bears witness to the decline of the study of the Masorah in the late Middle Ages. They just weren't very interested. So we will finish up by looking at a modern edition of the Masorah. This is, how much of it we can see? Well, we can see some of it. Well, let's have a look at the whole thing first. I can't make it go any bigger than that. I don't know why. Can I make it go bigger than that? No, it won't let me. You can see there are also notes down the bottom. And this is what it is. This is the Biblia Hebraica Quinta Edizione. It is the 5th edition of the Hebrew Bible. It's reworked. It used to be called the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, which was the Stuttgart Hebrew Bible. And the BHS, as it was known, this is the platinum grade level academic Bible. If you're doing serious academic work and you want a reliable text, because you have to have a reliable text, this is where you go to in the academic world. You go to BHS, or as it's now known, the Biblica Quinta, the 5th version. This was started off by Paul Carla, who we mentioned earlier, who tried to see the Aleppo Codex and wasn't allowed. And because he wasn't allowed, the codex that underlies this, the manuscript that underlies this, is the Leningrad Codex. So that's the default Hebrew text here, but in place it has been amended or changed if there's manuscript evidence that seems to say, well, Leningrad's a bit dodgy here. This seems to be more in the direction of these 2 or 3 or 4 manuscripts. Again, this is real technical stuff. The 5th edition is still being worked on. They haven't actually got all the books out yet, but all the Torah is out, which is good. You can get it in a little paperback, which I did once. And it's a good, another place to find a Masoretic text and the notes is that Bar Ilan University edition called Haketa, Mikra Gedolot Haketa, and that text is based on Aleppo, and that's got the Aleppo Masoretic notes. This one is based on Leningrad, and it's got the Leningrad Masoretic notes. So there will be differences again, but if you actually want to investigate this, if your heart pulls you towards this, this wonderful enterprise, you'd want one of those 2. They're both quite easy to find. Now, before the early editions of BHS, of this academic Hebrew Bible, didn't have the Masorah in at all, because people just think, late medieval comments, that's not going to reflect the original text of the Hebrew Bible. But things have changed, and it's now viewed as a very interesting and valuable resource, and it's now printed. So what does the Masorah look like? Well, there are 2 types. This is what's known in Latin as the Masorah Parva, or the Little Masorah. And these relate to verses. We'll go back and see how sort of blow by blow on particular words. Down the bottom, this is shorthand for the Masorah Magna, the big Masorah, and that will expand these tiny notes and give you full biblical references. Down here, we have the editor's notes. They cross-reference to very early copies of the Bible that do preserve vowel traditions. So we'll come again, we'll look at this in a moment. But first, what I want to do is to point out how much of the information on this page we use and we take for granted, but is not there in the original Masoretic text. First of all, if you actually look at a Sefer Torah, there is no heading that says Bereshit. That's just a convention, we call it Bereshit. Genesis, of course, is the Greek name. Then we have a chapter number. The Masoretic text is not divided into chapters. The chapters and also the verse numbers, which are not in the Masoretic text, but we're all using, they are a medieval invention by a Christian. Tradition says it's an English bishop called Stephen Langton, and that's somewhere around the, I think it's 1200s, 1300s. He invented this. I don't know if it really was him or not, but we're still using that. Even Jews use it, though chapter and verse numbers are a Christian invention because it's so convenient. Before that, and you'll find this in earlier Jewish commentators, they're forced to say the bit about Esau or the episode of the golden calf. And they can't actually pin it down. You just meant to know the whole thing off by heart. They give you the story. You go, oh, it's that verse. For those of us who don't have total recall of the Bible, and I am one of those people, chapter and verse is very nice because you can find it much, much quicker and much more easily. You will also know punctuation. Here is the classical Hebrew full stop. That's not in the Masoretic text. And of course, we have the vowels and we have the laning notes. None of those are in the Masoretic text. That's all Masoretic additions. When I say Masoretic text here, I'm meaning the original consonantal text, for instance, as in the Dead Sea Scrolls or as in the Sefer Torah. So all that stuff is either the Masoretes or medieval Christians. And we all use it all the time because we can't not anymore. We do, however, have an original feature of the text, which is much earlier than the Masoretes. These are Ptukot and Stumot. So this letter Pei, which you probably would skip over, Pei is a sign for Patuach, open. There will be, in the actual Sefer Torah, the line will end here and there will be a blank to the end. There won't be text as there is here. The other variant is a Tuma, which is shown by a samek, and that means it'll be like here, there'll be text on either side of a break. So it's a paragraphing system. And the Patuach is the main paragraph, and the Satum, which is closed on both sides, is the subparagraph. And that's the original division of biblical books, not chapters and verses. And they are actually quite significant for interpreting. This is Bereshit, so each day has its own paragraphing, if you like. Here we are, Yom Echad, but then the first day, there's a space in the text. Yom Sheni, second day, there's a space in the text. So those are things that, some original, a couple of original things, but a lot of non-original things. If we look down the bottom, the editors have put in, as I said, comparisons to other early manuscripts, and we'll just look at the first one because it's interesting. It says Orig. Orig is short for Oregon, or Origin, who was an early Christian scholar. He died in 254, and he produced a book called the Hexapla, in which we had the original Hebrew, the Hebrew put into Greek letters, a Greek translation, and various other things that I can't even remember now. But the interesting thing about having a Greek transliteration of the Hebrew is 400 years before the Masoretes. He tells us what it sounded like, and we can hear the vowels, because otherwise we wouldn't know. So you might remember, and we talked about this as a translation problem, Bereshit can be translated as in the beginning, where actually I have to say it'd be much more logical if it said Bareshit in the beginning. The alternative is Bereshit bara Elokim, in the beginning of God's making. Well, we already saw variants in translations that follow version A or version B. Well, given the fact that the shva here, the b, which tends to interpret this as in the beginning of God's making, that's a Masoretic vowel. What about a vowel from 400 years earlier? And the manuscripts of Oregon tell us we have Resith or Baresith. So obviously some people were pronouncing it as Bareshit, which is the origin of the in the beginning translation, as opposed to the in the beginning of translation. So you might be surprised, but actually some of this is relevant for understanding how to translate the Bible. We also have a little sign here, Samar, which means the Samaritan Torah, which is different from ours. That says Ba Rashit. Okay, different vocalization altogether. What about the actual Masoretic notes? Well, we'll look at verses 7 and 8 are actually much easier to understand. The little circle, which is modern, just says, okay, comment coming up here. If it's over a word, the comment is just that word, like here. If it's between two words, as in Vaya'as Elokim, it means both those words are included in the comment. So we're going to ignore the first comment because it relates to this circle. What we want is the comment that relates to Vaya'as Elokim, and God made the firmament. And it says here, there's a little tiny, I hope you can see it, there's a little tiny vav. Oh, sorry, no, it's actually a dalet. I'm sorry, it's not very clear. I couldn't actually make it any clearer than that. Dalet means 4. So the phrase Vaya'as Elokim appears 4 times in the entire Tanakh. Yes, they've counted. The little footnote here, 10, takes you down to the bottom here. There's 10, there's 10. And if you look up the big Masoretic note, it'll quote you all 4 verses where it appears, in case you wanted to find out where it appears. Okay. Not content with that, we have a little circle on Vayavdel, and God divided, with a little note Gimel. The exact word Vayavdel, down to vowels and everything, appears Gimel times in the whole of Tanakh, 3 times in the whole of Tanakh. And if you want, you'd go to the little footnote, number 11, and you would look up the big Masoretic note there, which would tell you all of those occurrences. So as I say, it's sort of nitpicky computery. It's slightly weird. And it's done this all the way through. If we actually look at Vayichen is a slightly interesting one, which is at the end of verse 8. No, where is it? No, at the end of verse 7. Vayichen, it was so. We can see a little circle. And that little circle relates here to a whole little sort of word, be'in, vav be'in. So what it's saying is it occurs 6 times. Be'in is short for be'inyana in this section. Vayichen occurs 6 times in the account of Bereshit. So it's a vague reference from before there were actual verse numbers. You could look for them. You'd know that most of them were in here. They were in this part of the Tanakh, and you wouldn't find them anywhere else. So they are tiny little annotations. Here you're told all sorts of things like the number of times it appears at the beginning of a verse, the number of times it appears in the middle of a verse, where those are, how many times it appears in the Torah as opposed to the rest of Tanakh. And there are huge, huge sort of, it's almost like compressed amounts of information in this system. The most common is a lamed. Lamed stands for late. There isn't another one like it, basically. There isn't. So anyway, you see a lamed, you know that that exact form, here it's Yom Sheni, 2nd day, that doesn't appear exactly like that anywhere else in the whole of Tanakh. So if you're looking for unique phrases and occasionally unique words, you look for the lameds, and here they're all over the place, and you can actually find them. It's pretty amazing. Do that without computers, blimey, how do they do it? And they are very important for preserving the text, because when the scribe comes along to write this, he can check. He can go, well, I should have 6 Vaya'as Elokim. He counts them, he's got 7, so he knows one of them is wrong. So then he can go to the Masorah Magna, the big Masorah notes, and find, okay, red is the one I got wrong. Okay, I'm going to change that one because I see I made a mistake. So there are checks and balances and corrections and compressed information. Computer systems actually do this. They do metadata. This is the metadata of the Torah. So we can round off by saying the Masoretes really preserved the Bible in the best way they could. A Bible that could be read and understood. They enabled it to be read and understood and sung, of course. In spite of their efforts, biblical texts in the Middle Ages weren't uniform, and we know that from all sorts of questions people asked their rabbis about visiting scribes who told them their Sefer Torah were wrong. And there were differences in spelling, and that didn't change till printing. Printing is the only way you can get it right every time, and even then you can make mistakes. But it's thanks to the Masoretes that our biblical text is so accurate. It is very accurate. Most of the differences are down to missing vavs, extra yods. Place names might have a kaf instead of a bet, or a bet instead of a kaf. There might be more than one variant of those. But generally speaking, this is the best preserved text from the ancient world. Homer isn't this good. The works of Virgil aren't this good. They didn't have Masoretes to preserve it for them. So because of the Masoretes, we have a very clean text, really. Tiny, tiny variations, but basically a good text. We know how to pronounce it. We have preserved our singing tradition of it, even if that's varied over times, but we have a tradition we can sing it from. And it's all thanks to the Masoretes. So I invite you to adopt a Masorete as your favorite person. I think they're just wonderful. And I think we should never, ever forget what they have done for us, because they just are such incredible people. So I'm going to try and unshare, though I've managed to move the, there we are, maybe I can unshare. Where are we? I don't know. Make it smaller. Nope, that's not going to work. How can I unshare it? Stop share, there we are. Okay, and if anyone's got any questions, I will do my very best to answer them.
A whole bunch in the chat box.
Oh, so there are, I haven't been looking. Okay, where do we start? The majority of the word he is actually written the Vav, indeed. Yes, somebody's noticed we got onto the fact that Vav of Gachon is not the middle. Yes, perfect example of the filters of translation. Yes, chaser doesn't mean defective, it just means not complete, exactly, it is the classical term. The exact analysis brought up during the Bible codes. Yes, this whole thing disproves the Bible codes, because the Bible codes seems you have one solid, absolutely unvarying text, and we don't. We do have several Masoretic texts. You know, Aleppo and Leningrad Codexes are not the same. Different printed Hebrew Bibles are based on different origins. Occasionally this has implications for translation, not always, but it knocks the Bible codes into a cocked hat, because unless you've got a stable, unvarying text, you can't count letters and intervals between letters. So yeah, this is the proof that Bible codes are not really working. Midway letters were out. Yup. Yeah, we honestly don't know why they don't fit. No idea. Regarding the Nikud, I'm guessing that was Nikud. They switched the names of the vowels, maybe, or maybe they just switched. Did they switch the names of the vowels? Did they switch the signs? I think it's a bit difficult to tell. Were there any purpose-written codexes? They were never damaged Torah scrolls. No, people wrote them. No. You could write a Torah scroll or you could write a codex. They were two options. I don't think codexes were ever made out of damaged Torah scrolls, because Torah scrolls are written on one side of the parchment. Codexes are written on both sides of the page. It's curious, despite the constant rivalry between the rabbinic communities in Palestine and Babylon, which the Babylonians invariably won, the Masoretes and Tiberius won the vowel system. Yeah, it is, isn't it? I have no idea why. Don't know why. Don't know if anyone knows. Do vowels and both systems match? Difficult to tell, because quite honestly, without sound recordings, we have no way of knowing how anyone pronounced any vowel pre-recordings. You know, maybe what we think of as an or was actually pronounced as an ah, and the fact there are different traditions in different Jewish communities. You think of Ashkenazi Hebrew or Polish Hebrew, vowel pronunciation is completely different, for instance, from Sephardi pronunciation. And Sephardim differ between themselves as to vowel pronunciation. So we don't know. Were the Ben Ashes Karaites? There are theories they were, there were theories they weren't. I think the general opinion is they weren't. It rather depends who you ask. The Karaites are very keen to claim all the Masoretes as essentially Karaite, and Rabbinites tend to be that, no, they weren't. Ich Machloket, I'm not sure about, oh, that could be for the Karaite, the Karaite Rabbinite thing. Yeah, it's very complicated. Which text did the Koran Bible use? Oh, good question. I don't know. I think it was really before they started publishing the original Koran, the sort of Jerusalem Bible one. I think that might be Leningrad. I can tell you that the Tanakh that is issued to soldiers in the Israeli army, that's Leningrad, because it was organized by Mordechai Breuer, and he was a big fan of Leningrad. iPad, I'm not sure what iPad is. All the codexes are mentioned were purpose written. Yes, oh yes. Carla doesn't think the Ballet Menorah preserved language so much as invented a new version that never existed. Maybe. Again, Carla is not the last word. You know, he died a while back. Lovely man, actually, very philosemitic, and did what he could to help Jews under Nazi persecution. What's it called that tallies the number of times that words appear? It's the Masoretic tradition, the Masoretic notes. Basically, it's or just the Masorah. Some people just say the Masorah to mean all of that. When you pronounce pronouncing, what's the reason for this? It's a tradition. It is a Masoretic tradition that goes way back. Some of these go even further back than our Masoretic knowledge. You just have pronouncements. You know, we write it like this and we say it like that. So yeah, there's an Israeli linguist who's written a book analyzing all the corrective variations. different reasons. Again, it depends where you're coming from. You can be a Radak and go, yeah, it's because of slippage, scribal slippage over the years, or you can be Kabbalistic and go, there are deep spiritual reasons for these different readings and vocalizations. So a lot of it depends what you're bringing to that question. But there's more than one opinion on that. By Yosef Fear, maybe? One of them to Manukah. Well, yeah, indeed. Is our the Masoretic text? It'll be a Masoretic text. I can't tell you which one. But if you go to turn to the front, the introduction, the preface, they may say the Hebrew text is based on the Leningrad, or the Hebrew text is based on Aleppo. Those are your main contenders nowadays. In the Haredi world, they don't do this sort of criticism, so they're mostly based on the very, very old traditional text, which itself is based on the Second Rabbinic Bible of 1526 to 1527, which was edited by a gentleman who then became Christian. And most traditional uncritical texts are based on that printed text, which is not a good one.
Dr. Guthartz? Excuse me, Dr. Guthartz. Yeah. So the Eitz Chaim is based on the Keter Aram Tsova, as they say in their introduction.
Yeah, excellent. Fantastic. So there's one. You'll find more modern and more modern Orthodox or progressive editions will use the Aleppo or the Leningrad or something that's got sort of academic base, and the Haredi world will just go with some sort of dissent. They're not very aware of the issue, so they'll just be uncritically using stuff that goes back to this bloke, Yaakov ben Chaim, or Paul ben Chaim, as he became, which is not very good by anyone's standards, quite honestly. When were the Tanakh Kriya added? Well, that's Masoretic activity. It's probably around the same time as the vowels, but again, we don't know. Why were they added? Presumably so people could chant in a system that was recognized. Whether it's the same as ours, nobody's going to know because there are no recordings, but clearly it's evidence of an accepted way of chanting that reflected the grammatical phrasing of the text, because actually the Tanakh Kriya are very useful for understanding the way the text hangs together, and occasionally they will affect the translation too. So, or they'll affect interpretation. So Rashi on chapter 1 of Yechezkel, of Ezekiel, actually bases an interpretation of an obscure point in the vision of the Ezekiel's chariot on the laning notes. He says, well, look, this goes with this. It's phrased together by the laning, therefore it has to mean this. So occasionally, not often, but occasionally they have implication for the meaning and therefore for the translation. In verse 1, Breshit is spelled with a different vowel under the shin than we use today. I think it's a chirik, isn't it? Breshit. Don't know if it's different than we use today. The problematic vowel is the very first one.
The text that you showed us in the beginning there, it was a segol, and yet we say Breshit.
Wait a minute, let me have a look.
Yeah, it is a minor. You can feel free to address more significant questions, but
let's have a look.
The Greek was
yes, actually, but oh no, it's probably because it's not a very clear copy. No, when I look at it in my printed copy, it's a laning note. It's a tipcha next to the chirik, and it makes it look like a segol, but it's not. It's a chirik.
Oh, thanks so much.
So I'm sorry. It's just because I couldn't get any.
It was brilliant. Definition. Brilliant.
What are the little bubbles? Those are the little the notes that say there's something in the margin. So it's little circle says, if it's above one word, there is a note on this word in the margin. If it's between two words, there's a note on this phrase consisting of two words in the margin. If you've got a 3-word phrase, you'll have word, bubble, word, and that'll tell you that group of 3 words has the next note in the margin. So those are modern, those are not Masoretic. I have a feeling the Masoretes didn't put anything in to mark their marginal notes. You just have to know what they're talking about. Why at the end of a sidra do we find a triple pale samech? Probably to show you it's the end of a sidra. Again, that doesn't actually appear in the Sefer Torah. That's probably more a feature of Chumashim, I should think. Balatrum uses Masorah to attribute all kinds of interesting information to the twin phrases and words, I'm sure, because if you are that way inclined, you can get vast amounts of information out of the Masoretic list, including interpretative information. If you want to say, look, it's significant that you have a double here, it's significant we can find something, then it gives you all the raw material to do that. So yes, a lot of people, when back in the day when people studied Masorah, people were using Masorah, but in the late Middle Ages, well, Balatur went to use 1300s. Yeah, after he may have been one of the last people who really was a master of the Masorah. With the advent of computers, was it found the words they counted were correct? No, they died. Well, again, depends which text you use, but largely not, which leaves us with this problem of, why isn't it correct? It's difficult to know. Who were the men of the Great Assembly? Well, traditionally, Ezra starts them off. Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, they're referred to in the Mishnah. They're referred to as a long time back from the Mishnah. Mishnah's roughly 200 CE. They seem to be BCE, and we don't know much about them. There's a tradition, there was 120 of them, which is why the Israeli Knesset has 120 members. But at the beginning of Pirkei Avot, there's a reference to these people were among the last of the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, but they are very shadowy. Sometimes the Mishnah seems to use them for meaning a long time ago. So they'll say, Anshe Knesset HaGedolah came up with this. There's no way we can prove or disprove this, but what it certainly means to the people at the time of the Mishnah is that is so old we don't know really when we started doing that. Yes, the fact that we are not 100% sure about writing our Sifrei Torah is the reason that we don't have a blessing said by the scribe when he finishes writing it, because it's a mitzvah to write a Sefer Torah, certainly a mitzvah that's definitely incumbent upon men, and there might be arguments about whether or not it's incumbent on women, depends on all sorts of other things, but there is no bracha said, because we're not absolutely sure we got all the Vavs and Yuds right. Etz Chaim has many misprints, entirely possible. It's a difficult thing to proofread, let me tell you. Thanks, whoever let me just know that the Etz Chaim is based on the Keter. I'll look up what the Keter is. The Keter is the Aleppo Codex. So you can look up on Wikipedia, so I think it's got a decent article on the Aleppo Codex. When did Gematria involve? I think that involved early on because you get it in early midrash. I couldn't tell you, I couldn't put a date on it, but I'm guessing roughly around the time that midrash becomes written down. I'm not sure. When were the different songs sung to the different tunes, such as Yamim Noraim tune? Right, there are 6 versions of Trop, okay? There's Torah, Haftorah, Megillat Esther, Eicha, High Holy Days, and then there's the one that does duty for Ruth, Kohelet, and Shir Shirim. They're all sung to the same tune. I don't know when they started sounding different. We don't have any recordings I'm guessing 20th century. I don't think anyone was recording Trop in the 19th century. So we only have the notation. There is one medieval example by Ovadia the proselyte, who was an ex-Christian priest and had probably learned the medieval system of writing Western music, the Neume system. And he wrote down a bit of laning. He transcribed it into this Western system. But if you play it, it doesn't sound like anything we do today in any community at all. So we honestly don't know when they evolved. Maybe it was one tune for everything. We just do not know. There are Masoretic Te'amim notes on the Tehillim as well, and we've lost that tradition. We don't really, I don't know if there are some communities that have preserved their own version. But
I think the historians have the Tehillim.
Right, entirely possible. Ashkenazim don't. I think we've lost it completely. And the thing is, because we have so many different tunes, there's Eastern Ashkenazic and Western Ashkenazic. I do Western Ashkenazic, probably anyone in the American continent is doing Eastern Ashkenazic, which comes from Eastern Europe. The Dutch and the British are the last homes of Western Ashkenazic. But then you've got Libyan and Tunisian and Moroccan and Yerushalmi and Syrian and Iraqi, and they all sound different. So it's difficult for pre-recording to keep a musical tradition absolutely static. It evolves because it's oral. So we honestly don't know how far any of these things go back. Dart Mikra is Leningrad based, yes, indeed, because largely because of the influence of Rabbi Mordechai Brau, who was a big fan of Leningrad. Difference for Rosh Hashanah only Ashkenazi, entirely possible. Again, it's so community based because it's orally transmitted. Question Ray Pinchas. Do you want to ask your question, Ray Pinchas?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I'm a very slow and lousy typist. I was trying to understand your point about the Vav in Brit Shalom in Pinchas. Are you saying it's merely an orthographic issue? Because I've seen a fair amount of interpretive semantic questions about the meaning, that it's not, et cetera, given the actions of Pinchas, et cetera. So I was just trying to understand your point there.
It's a tradition that's part of the Masorah. So the Masorah encompasses not only spelling, but also big letters, small letters, dots over letters, broken letters. So it's part of the Masorah. The interpretative load given to it is almost certainly later. Well, at least we haven't got any proof that anyone, you know, it appears in the midrash and on. So that seems to have been an early feature of text that is then later interpreted. Unless, I don't know, maybe those interpretations do go way, way back, but I don't think we have any evidence of.
So we don't really know about we don't really know about the origin. I mean, it could have been
none of these things. None of these things. You know, maybe is this the way God gave it to Moshe, or you know, the Radak would say, no, much of this is scribes making mistakes. Many Kabbalists will say, yes, of course, this is exactly what Moshe got, and all of it has loads of meaning. So as I said before, it depends which end what assumptions you have when you come to look at it. Yeah. What else we got? Whoever mentioned the Keter in relation to Etz Chaim, can you mention again what it was? The Keter is the Aleppo Codex. Okay. Rabba used Leningrad. He certainly used other codices as well. Oh, definitely. But he's very fond of the Leningrad. It's interesting here. He explains his methodology in an appendix to the Mossad Rav Kook Tanakh. Okay, good place to look. Do I have a preferred edition? Well, they're all Masoretic. You know, I have no strong feelings Aleppo versus Leningrad. As long as it's nice and clean, I'll use Mossad Rav Kook's version. I'll use the Bar Ilan version, which I like because they have lovely their commentaries are nice critical editions. So I'm not too fussed. Also, you know. Let's face it, most of the differences are down to this vowel or that vowel, and it very rarely makes huge interpretative meaning. And it's nice to know that when you're learning, you've got the vowels correct and you haven't got some sort of 16th century version, but it doesn't have a huge amount. If you're not a Masorete who gets very excited about these things, it doesn't have a huge practical thing. Was the Masorah accepted at the time? Yeah, it was the great scholars of the time. We're all very grateful to them. Everyone accepted the Masorah, as far as I know. The Mossad Rav Kook Tanakh is based on the Keter, on the Aleppo, and that edition was done by Broy in 1989. Oh, interesting. Didn't know that. Don't know anything about the Mossad Rav Kook Tanakh. As far as I understand, their Torah Chaim series is based on the Leningrad. Actually, I think when I wrote this, I went back to the introduction and had a little read. Gematria would appear in the Talmud. Yeah, so, you know, Midrashic period, that's all the same time. Early rabbinic, you know, Aramaic period, the stuff is coming up, definitely. Yeah. Right, I think we've done all the questions in the chat.
Yeah, a lot of questions. They kept you busy. Okay, that's good. That's always good. Lots of questions. Yeah. By the way, for those who are interested in more in the Tamei HaMikra, so last year, Rabbi Jeremy Weider, Rosh Yeshiva at YU, who's really probably the world's best Balkori in terms of his Medakdek and Hadar Lane, they have a 5-part series on Tamei Mikra. And what I learned most from that series is I'm never going to lane again. But it was really goes through a lot of the stuff. I mean, it's technical. The first one's more of an introduction. That was a 5-part series. You can find it on our recording. Just put in, Jeremy Weider. It was last January. Gave a 5-part series on Tamei Mikra, and he talked about Tilim Mishneh. They're separate Tamei, structure. But anyways, but that's if people want to follow up on that. Okay, thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you next week and more questions and questions, answers, and thank you very much. This evening, of course, 8:30, Mark Shapiro continues his fascinating series on Shaul Lieberman. That's tonight at 8:30 p.m. Tomorrow, Rachel Sharansky-Danziger continues her series on human relations in the book of Bereshit. That's tomorrow at 11. And then Wednesday, Rav Carmel continues his series Be'ivrit on David HaMelech. And then at night, Moshe Sokolov on how the Tanakh was put together, which is, I think, a very nice balance with what you're talking about. He's sort of addressing slightly different issues, but it's very much related to what you're saying. And then Thursday, Shuli Mishkin continuing her series. And this week's Parsha Shir will be given by Rabbi Gedalia Berger, who teaches at GPATS, among other things, at program at Stern, and then Friday morning, my shir on the Siddur at 9:30. So we look forward to learning with you. Please bring your friends, and okay, have a wonderful day, everybody. Thank you very much, and thank you, and experience all 4 seasons, maybe in one day in London. Probably this is the time of year when you get a little bit of summer still, a little bit of fall, and can get cold winter, so maybe we'll get all 4 seasons in London today. Okay, very good. Thank you very much. Okay, bye-bye, everybody. Bye.